In healthcare, in therapy, clear communication, it can literally make all the difference. So today, we're going to tackle a really foundational tool for that communication, the SOAP note. We're going to break down this simple but super powerful framework to help you write notes that are clear, concise, and just clinically effective. Okay, but before we dive into the how, let's back up a bit and talk about the why. So I want you to just think for a second. What is the real goal of all this paperwork? I mean, is it just about checking a box for compliance, or is there something, deeper going on? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple, but it's also really profound. At the end of the day, the number one goal is effective communication. It's all about creating this clear, coherent story that can be understood by you, your colleagues, and really anyone else involved in a client's care. That's what ensures the quality and continuity of that care. All right, so here's our game plan for today. First, we'll cover the basics of what SOAP notes even are. Then, we're going to dive deep into each letter. S for the subjective story, O for the objective facts, A for the assessment, and P for the action plan. And to wrap it all up, we'll look at what really makes these notes work in the real world. Let's be real. Clinical documentation can feel, well, overwhelming. It can get messy, right? The SOAP note is like this elegant, time-tested solution. It gives you a simple, logical framework to structure all your thoughts and observations. So, SOAP is an acronym, and each letter kind of builds on the one before it. We kick things off with S for subjective. That's the client's story in their own words. Next up is O for objective. These are the hard facts, what we can actually see. Then comes A for our assessment. This is where we put our thinking caps on and analyze the first two. And we finish with P for the plan, what we're going to do next. It's just a beautifully simple way to organize a really complex story. All right, let's jump right in with the first letter, S, for subjective. This is where the client's voice is the star of the show. It's all about their story, their experience, their unique perspective. So the subjective section is literally all about what the client tells you. We're talking about their feelings, their self-reports, their direct experiences. You can almost think of it as you being a journalist, capturing their personal narrative of the session. Okay, so how do we nail this section? What are the best practices? First off, use the client's own words as much as you can. Direct quotes, they're pure gold. And you've got to dig a little deeper for context. Ask when, where, and how. But maybe the most important part is what you don't do. You don't pass judgment, and you don't throw in a bunch of irrelevant information. Just remember, in this section, your opinion has no place. Their story is what matters. Okay, moving on to O for objective. This is where we shift gears. We're moving from the client's internal world, what they feel, to the external world, what we can all see. The objective section is all about the cold, hard facts, nothing else. So if S was their story, O is what anyone, you, me, another observer, could see, measure, or observe in that room. Think things like the client's appearance, their behavior, maybe even specific test results. It's all verifiable data. So what does this actually look like in practice? You'll want to describe their appearance, their behavior. You might note their mood, that's their internal feeling they report, and their affect, which is the outward emotional expression that you can see. But here's the key. You have to avoid making assumptions or jumping to interpretations. For example, instead of writing the client was angry, you describe what you actually saw. The client spoke in a loud voice with a clenched jaw. You see the difference there? One is an interpretation, the other is a fact. And that brings us to A for assessment. Now, this is where your clinical brain really gets to shine. It's all about connecting the dots between the subjective story we heard and the objective facts we saw. Yeah, the assessment section is your professional synthesis. Based on everything in S&O, what are your clinical impressions? This is where you might document a diagnosis, talk about the client's progress, or maybe lack of progress, and explain your clinical reasoning. You're basically telling the ongoing story of their treatment from your professional viewpoint. So the absolute crucial point here is analysis, not just repetition. You can't just copy and paste what you wrote in the S&O sections. No way. You have to explain why it all matters. You'll want to list the client's problems, probably in order of importance, clearly explain your decision-making, and comment on their trajectory. Are they making progress? Are they regressing? Or have they kind of hit a plateau? And that brings us to the final letter, P for plan. So you've assessed the situation, now what? What are you going to do about it? This section is all about the next steps. The plan is exactly what it sounds like. It outlines the course of action. It spells out what you and the client have agreed to work on. This could include specific treatment strategies, goals for the very next session, maybe some referrals, and follow-up appointments. Think of it as the roadmap for all your future work together. A really strong plan is super clear and direct, and it has to flow logically, right, from your assessment. Using vague language like continue therapy, that's just not helpful, right? It doesn't give anyone any direction. Instead, you need to list concrete goals for the next session, and it's so important that these goals are realistic, which brings us to a fantastic concept called SMART goals. So that begs the question, right? I just mentioned unsmart goals. How do you make a plan smart? It's a really great framework that can turn these vague intentions into powerful, actionable steps. So let's break down what that means. The SMART framework is, you guessed it, another acronym. But it's a super useful one that helps make sure your goals are well-defined and actually effective. It's a tool that's used in all kinds of fields, but it's incredibly valuable in clinical planning to get everyone on the same page. Okay, let's break this down real quick. S is for specific, so reduce anxiety becomes practice breathing exercises for 5 minutes daily. See? Much clearer. M is for measurable. How are you going to track progress? A is for attainable. Is this actually realistic for the client right now? R is for relevant. Does this goal actually help with their bigger picture goals? And finally, T is for time-bound. It needs a deadline, like by our next session. This whole framework is what turns good intentions into a real solid plan. All right, so we've walked through S, O, A, and P. Let's start to wrap this up by looking at what makes a note really work. We're going to look at a weak note versus a strong one to really drive the point home. So here's a perfect example of what not to do. Just writing, client discussed relationship issues. Come on, it's so vague, it's kind of lazy, and it tells the next person who reads it almost nothing of value. This is a classic case of missing all the important stuff. Now, let's compare that to this. Client expressed frustration over lack of communication with a partner, stated feeling unheard and underappreciated. Wow, the difference is just night and day, right? By using specifics and quoting the client's own feelings, this note suddenly comes alive. It's informative. It provides real clinical insight. And that brings us to our final and maybe most important question. When you sit down to write your notes, ask yourself this: are you missing the so what? Because documentation isn't just about listing what happened. It's about analyzing why it matters. It's about showing your clinical reasoning and explaining the significance for the client's journey. And that, right there, is the real heart of a truly effective SOAP note.